Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Matt Rojansky. I'm the director of the Kennan Institute here at Wilson. We're gathered, of course, today to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Katyn Massacre. And we're very honored to have with us not only our very distinguished guest speakers, who will be introduced in a moment, but the ambassador of the Republic of Poland to the United States and to the Bahamas. Every time I say that, it just makes me feel wistful about my vacation last week. Piotr Wilczek, who hosted us for a very interesting discussion earlier today. I'm very grateful to have gotten to know him. And of course, our speakers, Alexander Guryanov of Memorial in Moscow and Andrzej Nowak of Poland's Jagiellonian University. I want to recognize also my colleague, Dr. Christian Osterman, who directs the History and Public Policy program, which is co-sponsoring today's event here at the Wilson Center, and our support from the Polish Embassy, from many team members of the Polish Embassy, but I want to single out Filip Jasinski, who worked incredibly hard with my colleague Izabela Taborowski, whom you'll hear from momentarily, to make this happen. It wouldn't have been possible without your exceptional efforts. I'm also pleased to announce, I don't know that this was clear from the invitation, that we actually have an exhibition opening today. We'll sort of unveil it this evening, and running for 2 months here at the Wilson Center. This is something we do from time to time. Some of you may recall that we did this on the 100th anniversary of a number of the newly independent Central European countries connected to Woodrow Wilson's 14 points just a few years ago. So this is something we've done before, and we'll have an exhibit on Katyn that comes from the Katyn Museum. So following immediately on this discussion, which will go about an hour and a half, I think, we'll move just across the hall, still on this floor, for a light reception, and you'll be able to view at least a part, I think, or most of the exhibit, which has been temporarily moved to the reception hall. So I think we'll be ushered in the right direction by my colleagues. Now, let me introduce Ambassador Wilczek, who will then introduce the event. Ambassador Wilczek has served as Polish ambassador to the United States and the Commonwealth of the Bahamas since 2016. He's a highly recognized intellectual historian, professor, writer, and translator. He's a graduate of the University of Silesia in Poland, where he's received his PhD and served as a professor and as dean for 22 years. During his diplomatic term, Ambassador Wilczek has developed defense cooperation between Poland and the United States, strengthened commerce and trade links, enhanced energy security, and advocated for Poland's long-awaited inclusion in the visa waiver program. Ambassador Wilczek is a board member of numerous international scholarly journals, advisory councils, and educational initiatives in Europe and the United States. He has edited 22 published monographs and over 100 journal articles, which have appeared in Poland, the United Kingdom, and the United States. So it is an honor and a pleasure to welcome you to our scholarly institution here, Ambassador Wilczek.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Guryanov, Professor Nowak, colleagues, thank you for joining us today, and many thanks to the Kennan Institute and Wilson Center for their hospitality. Many thanks to Matthew Rojansky, to Izabela, and the whole staff. It means a lot that so many people remember this important anniversary of the Katyn Massacre. In times of ongoing international conflicts and mass killings, the fate of the Polish intelligentsia, military and law enforcement officers, civil servants, and people of all faiths and professions is a powerful reminder and somber recollection. First of all, allow me to thank again the Kennan Institute and especially Izabela Taborowski for her engagement in organizing this unprecedented gathering of two renowned scholars, Professor Guryanov from Russia, from the Memorial Association, and Professor Nowak from Poland, the Polish Academy of Sciences and the Jagiellonian University. You will hear from researchers who are best prepared to talk about what happened in the Katyn Forest and what it means now after 80 years. Secondly, I am proud of the cooperation forged with the Warsaw Katyn Museum, from which we received an exhibition, just mentioned by Matthew, about the Soviet atrocities. It is a very special museum, and I encourage you all to visit. Last but not least, I would like to recognize a very special attendee. Mr. Eitner is the grandson of Polish police officer Kazimierz Eitner. Welcome, Mr. Eitner. Our guest, as I mentioned, is the grandson of a Polish police officer, Kazimierz Eitner, who perished in 1940, together with the thousands of other victims of the communist crime. Thank you for joining us in the Institute and sharing your family's story. Finally, please join me for a moment of silence, commemorating the victims of the Katyn Massacre. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I'm Isabella Tabarovsky with the Katyn Institute at the Wilson Center. I'd like to the announcements and the thank yous that were mentioned, I'd like to add a few words from our History and Public Policy program that is co-sponsoring today's event, that the program has released a new collection of primary source documents about the Katyn Massacre on its digital archive. The documents are drawn from archives in the United States and Russia. They include investigations made by the US government. They also include protests that the Soviet government made about memorialization plans in the United Kingdom. They include Soviet rejections of responsibility and later moves for internal investigations memorialization. And the files can be accessed by going to digitalarchive.org. Now, it is my honor to introduce our guests. I will start by introducing Dr. Guryanov. Alexander Guryanov is the Polish program coordinator for the Human Rights Center Memorial in Moscow. He is the author and co-author of numerous scholarly articles on Soviet political repressions against Polish citizens perpetrated after September 17, 1939. He compiled and co-authored the volume entitled Repressions Against Poles and Polish Citizens, published by Memorial in 1997. He also co-authored and co-edited 18 books in the Index of the Repressed series, jointly published by Memorial and the Warsaw-based Karta Center. And finally, he compiled and co-authored 2 books published by Memorial on the memory of the Katyn Massacre victims killed in Katyn and killed in Katyn, buried in Mednoye. And I want to point out, we have these books here. They're really extraordinary documents, and if you have a chance, come up after the event and take a look at them. Now, Professor Andrzej Nowak is a professor at the Institute of History of Jagiellonian University and is the head of the Comparative Imperial Studies section at the Institute of History at the Polish Academy of Sciences. Between 1980 and 1988, he was involved in anti-communist journalistic and educational activities in Poland, publishing many articles in the underground magazines, as well as participating in a system of alternative lectures of history for workers organized during the martial law in Poland. He is the author of more than 30 books. He has lectured as a visiting professor at several universities in the United States, and his main research interests include imperial studies, cultural and political history, and political thought in Russia and Eastern Europe in the 19th, 20th century, international relations, European historical memory policies. He has received many awards and honors, including the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest order. We will begin with Professor Nowak's presentation.
Thank you so much. It's, of course, a very grim occasion and a very grim story to be told here, but I would risk maybe a little bit strange assessment that this is a very grim story with a kind of hope in the end. We cannot help victims of this tragedy that we will discuss today. They cannot be revived. But one victim, and a very important one, that is truth, can be saved. And it is saved through the efforts of people like Dr. Guryanov and Memorial Society. So my first remembrance from Russia, when I visited Russia in 1989 for the first time on a historical conference dealing with 19th century history, I happened to be in Kalinin, as it was known at that time, now Tver. And one of participants of the conference, Russian historian, Byzantinologist, Maren Freidenberg, took me, grabbed me, and showed me a building in Kalinin, Tver. This is the place where NKVD shot Polish officers. It was, of course, absolutely forbidden by then to tell these things, even if it were times already of perestroika and of Gorbachev, it was still banned officially, truth. And it was strange because this man has a very strange name, Maren, which is simply abbreviation from Marx and Engels, a typical Soviet name in the interwar period. Both of his parents were shot in 1937, 1938 as Trotskyites. So he, son of communist parents who experienced tragedy that engulfed not just Poland, but first and foremost the Soviet Union, understood how it is important for other nations, other victims of that system, to find truth about the fate that we shared, actually, that we shared. If I would have to answer in one sentence what was the reason for Katyn, I would say that it was lethal combination of a universalist but totalitarian version of communist ideology with, I would call it, imperial geopolitics. First, I would try to say a few words about imperial geopolitics. There is Moscow, there is Berlin, and there is Warsaw in between. This is the gist of this imperial geopolitics. Two very powerful nations, two very powerful state structures that could be named and named themselves empires, that is Russia and Germany, throughout centuries fought for predominance over not only Eastern Europe, but Europe as such, continental Europe at least. And Poland being placed in between and losing many centuries fight with Russia for Eastern Europe was erased from the map by these two, actually at that time, three powers, with Habsburg Empire as the third element. When Poland was revived after more than 120 years with the help of the patron of this center, I mean President Wilson, it was endangered immediately, as many of you know, with the event that we will also celebrate this year as 100 years anniversary of the fight between Poland and Soviet Russia and successful defense of Poland, Warsaw, and not only Warsaw and Poland, but all Central Europe, many countries at least in Central Europe, from the perspective of being Sovietized and overwhelmed, exactly with this not only imperial geopolitics, drive of Bolshevik leaders to get to Berlin, to another center of communist hopes for Europe, but also imperial geopolitics, but also this communist ideology that should be spread, even with the help of the Red Army, even with the help of the force. And I'm mentioning 1920 not only because it's anniversary this year, but because it is one of the reasons that are debated still among historians. Why Katyn? Joseph Stalin was a commissar of one of two fronts that attacked Poland at that time in 1920, political commissar. He was striving to get to Lwów, and being just at the gates of Lwów, he cabled to Lenin that after we got Lwów, we would be able to Sovietize Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, Austria, all the way down to Italy. These are Stalin's words from July 1920. And he was stopped there. he was humiliated there by Polish army, and he was accused by his Bolshevik colleagues from Politburo that he was one of the responsibles for the debacle on the Warsaw, because he didn't release so-called Konarmia of Budionne, the powerful force that was with his front attacking Lwów, to help on the main line of attack towards Berlin by another front by Tuchachevsky. So for Stalin personally, 1920 was a big humiliation, political humiliation, that Poles were responsible of. This is not my interpretation. I must say that Katyn was a revenge, personal revenge by Stalin. But many historians, even serious historians, still ponder this possibility. Nevertheless, it is important context to understand what happened then. So Stalin, when he took power in the Soviet Union, prepared the country for the fight with the whole world, to use the nearest occasion to spread the revolution, to spread communist message in its Soviet version outside to Central Europe. And he used this occasion, as we know, in 1939. But before that, we must recollect another great achievement, not of Stalin, but of Memorial Society. I mean the fact that Memorial activists from Russia revealed the whole truth of an operation that was 6 times bigger crime in numbers, in sheer numbers, than Katyn. I mean so-called Polish operation. In 1937, 1938, where many of you know time of so-called the Great Purge in Russia, in which 656,000 people were shot during these 2 years in the Soviet Union. We usually collect that event with Anna Akhmatova and her son, Russian intellectuals, or old Bolshevik guard. But this is not true, or this is not the whole truth. The main culprit of the Great Purge were different nationalities, and Poles were number 1 on the list of victims. In the so-called Polish operation, on one order, and this is probably the single order because we don't have Nazi order from Wannsee Conference as a document, but we have document on Polish operation, and on this one order there were shot 111,091 people on one order, one paper. Why they were shot, Poles living in the Soviet Union? Because they were treated by Stalin as exactly unreliable minority that could undermine effort to fight this great war against Poland, against Central European countries, so it's better to get rid of them physically. And that's how it happened in 1937, 1938. Every 5th Pole living in the Soviet Union was shot. Every 2nd male, actually. So this was something that Norman Naimark from Stanford University called the most horrible example of pre-Holocaust genocide in the Soviet Union. Terry Martin, another scholar from here, from Harvard University, assessed that when you were Pole in the Soviet Union during the Great Purge, there was 40 times greater chance of being shot than being average citizen of the Soviet Union during that time. And the time came, the time for the war. Stalin extended his hand to Hitler in need in 1939, a Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which was not non-aggression pact, but the very essence of aggression pact that divided Eastern Europe, not just Poland, but also 3 Baltic republics and Romania, and Finland, by the way, were on this secret protocol. And as a consequence, Soviet army Red Army entered Poland. But before that, before September 17th, when the Red Army, according to the agreement with Hitler, entered to finish off with Poland, Ławrenty Beria, the new head of NKVD, Special Political Police in the Soviet Union, prepared 9 operational groups, 70 NKVD officers and 300 soldiers each, that were to prepare prescription lists of every member of Polish political parties, from the leftist to the rightist. Everyone member of Polish political parties were to be found on that list, along with Polish officials, Polish policemen, and so on and so forth. And it was a week before the attack of the Soviet army to the back of the Polish army fighting against Hitler, already for 2 weeks. And this preparation for further action of special forces was put into reality after September 17, when Red Army entered eastern Poland, nowadays western Ukraine and western Belarus. And Poland, helpless at that moment because all its forces were fighting against Germans, couldn't stop a new Soviet offensive, undeclared war. And that's why very quickly 250 to 270,000 Polish soldiers and officers became captives of the Red Army. Beria prepared a special directorate of NKVD already in September 20th to prepare camps for these prisoners. Average soldiers were relatively quickly released for some labor, for some forced labor, but officers were kept in several special camps. 3 of them were especially important: Kozielsk, near Katyn, near Smolensk; Starobielsk, near Kharkov, now in eastern Ukraine; and Ostashków, near Kalinin, Tver. Altogether, there were placed something like 15,000 officers and police officers of Poland. Among them, there were 11,000 of Polish officers, predominantly officers of reserve, that were summoned to defend the country during the Nazi aggression in September 1939. I'm stressing that fact that there were reserve officers predominantly because they were in their everyday life medicine doctors, architects, lawyers, simply the elite, intellectual elite of Poland. There were not just 20 generals, several hundred of colonels, many thousands of majors and captains, but they were, to stress again, the intellectual elite of Poland. And that made them a special, I would say, victim from the point of view of Stalin. Of course, for their final fate, I would say that not only this general, I would say, reason was important, general reason to decapitate Poland, to finish off with its elite. Actually, this goal, this general goal, was shared between Stalin and Hitler. There were at least 4 conferences between SS officers and NKVD officers, first of them in Brest, Brześć Litewski, others in Zakopane and in Kraków, where NKVD and SS debated methods of fighting with Polish elites, with Polish underground. It is not certain, and I doubt it personally, that these conferences decided the fate of all the victims of what we call Katyn operation. No, it was decided by Stalin himself. But at the same time, Hitler initiated exactly analogical operation, so-called AB operation, in which many thousands of Polish intelligentsia were shot in Palmyry, Piaśnica, in many other places, exactly at the same time, the beginning of 1940, the first month of 1940. So there is no proof that there was a combined action, but the action was parallel. That is something that we can say for sure. And the fact is that SS and NKVD debated methods of eliminating Polish resistance. The moment of decision to liquidate physically Polish officers in these 3 camps that I mentioned came in early March. What happened? What made this decision to happen? Actually, it was the time when Stalin was humiliated again in his not very successful war against Finland. I would like to remind you that Finland was also on the list of Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. It belonged to Stalin according to that pact. So Stalin wanted to get Finland, but unlike Poland, Finland was not attacked from 2 sides, but only from one side, the Soviet side. And defending bravely and getting help from Western countries, from especially United Kingdom and France, still not attacked by Germany at that time, Finland was able at least to make some anxiety in Moscow, especially when Stalin learned from his agents in MI5 in London that London ponders bombing of Baku and other oil fields in southern Soviet Union as a means of deterring Russia from further action in Finland. So Stalin decided to stop the war in Finland, and it saved Finland for several decades, actually. But this particular moment persuaded Stalin that it is dangerous to have Polish officers that could be used with changed political situation by the army, Polish army that already recreated itself in France at that time and was to intervene in Finland. There was a Polish brigade, so-called Podhalańska Brigada, that was to be sent to Finland to fight against Soviet Union. And this could be, we don't have sure sources from what was going on in Stalin's mind, but this could be another reason that Stalin decided at that particular moment, March, the beginning of March, the end of February 1940, that the best way of solving Polish problem is to behead it, that is to behead Polish nation. And so Ławrenty Beria, head of NKVD, sent a kind of memorandum to Politburo on March 2nd, 1940, in which he enumerated 14,736 officers from these 3 camps and suggested to kill also 11,000 of inmates in different political prisons in Lvov, Minsk, and other cities of occupied half of eastern Poland. Actually, the final action that was so to speak, authorized by Politburo 3 days later, March 5th, Stalin signed together with Mołotov, Voroshilow, Mikoyan, Kaganowicz, and Kalinin. They signed the final decision to do what Beria proposed officially. So finally, they decided to shoot 22,000 people. On one order. So now we have another one single order in which there is every detail of every name, and it was checked before killing. And every one of these victims was killed individually, not with a machine gun, not in a gas chamber. It doesn't mean any better or worse, this kind of death. Nevertheless, it makes it unique because every single person was shot with a single shot by a single man. So it means a great operation to kill individually 22,000 people. Actually, it is also important to stress that not one of these henchmen that did this operation was somehow gotten by the justice hand. Quite the opposite. 125 among them were given financial, so to speak, remuneration for their efforts to kill so many people. The operation took place in April and May 1940. It was very difficult logistically. It was done in 3 places, basically, as regards these three camps. In Kozielsk, inmates from Kozielsk were transported to Katyn near Smolensk when they were shot in a forest individually. People from Starobielsk were transported to Kharkov when they were shot in the prison of NKVD in this city. Just like in Ostashkov, people from that camp were transported to Kalinin and they were shot in the prison. And from there, their bodies were transported to Miednoje when they were buried. It is interesting that in Katyn, the henchmen used a German type of pistol, Walter, because it was very popular among NKVD. That would be important in Katyn's lie. But in Miednoje and in Kharkov, the pistol that was used and ammunition that was used was Soviet Nagant type of pistol. And by the way, Kalinin was never occupied by German army, so there is no way to say that Germans got there and using Soviet type of pistols shot Polish officers. Nevertheless, I am stressing these elements because Dr. Guryanov would say afterwards, I will finish in a minute, how the lie about Katyn developed. Besides 900 people from Lvov prison, 500 people from Łódzk, 500 people from Równo, 500 people from Tarnopol, 400 people from Stanisławów, 200 people from Drohobycz. These were quotas set by Beria. So many people must be shot, and they were shot in the same operation. We don't have the exact quota for Belarus. The list of Belarus victims, I mean, those who were killed in contemporary Belarus in Katyn operation, so-called Katyn operation, is still not accessible. That is one of important goals for historians to get this Belarusian list. The operation ended in May 1941, and it was revealed 2 years later by Germans. I will stop. I want just to say one word.
40 rok, w maju 40.
Yes, that's right, but the final revelation to the public, to the universal public, went with communique of German Berlin radio in April 1943. And I want to end on this note. 2 days later, it happened on April 13, 1943, when Germans reached Katyn and learned before about what happened there and wanted to use it in anti-Soviet propaganda. Polish government decided to ask International Red Cross to clarify the situation. And 2 days later, on March 15, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, whom so many of us admire, and I belong to that group that admire Winston Churchill, invited Polish Prime Minister in exile, General Sikorski, to breakfast and told him, it is obvious that the Soviets did it, but we will not reveal it, because otherwise we would compromise our relationship with the power on which depends the final outcome of the war. So we have to lie, and we will lie consequently. And the history of that lie would be revealed in details by Dr. Guryanov. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say that Dr. Guryanov will speak in Russian, so if you need to, please use your headsets. If you don't have one but need one, raise your hand and somebody will... Can we get one? Okay, just... I'm seeing maybe about 10 or so that we need. So English is on channel 2, Russian is on channel 1. Okay. So I think maybe why don't we start, and we'll be bringing the headsets in a moment. Please.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, at the beginning, I would like to say that I am very grateful to the Katyn Institute for invitation for today's meeting and for the opportunity to speak to you. Unfortunately, my English is not good enough, so I will have to speak Russian. and to use the help of the wonderful interpreter, Mr. Wojciechowski.
The Katyn massacre is not only a non-trialed murder of 14,000 Polish prisoners of war and 7,300 prisoners of prisons based on the decision of Politburo decision dated March 5th of 1940. It is also a 50-year-long campaign of disinformation and lies that Soviet Union was disseminating all around the country and around the world. This campaign is known as the Katyn lie. The fundamental change in the official position of the USSR took place in 1990, and 1 year later the USSR collapsed, and the problem of attitude to the Katyn crime was inherited by Russia. So the goal of my speech is to tell you briefly about the history of the Katyn lie. This history can be divided into three main stages. One is from April 1940 to the moment of German announcement in April 1943. Phase 2 from April 1943 to Soviet admission of guilt in 1990. And Phase 3 is from 1990 until today. This Phase 1 started simultaneously with the executions of 1940. In the course of 6 weeks, the prisoners of war were sent day after day from the camps to the places of executions in groups of several dozens to a group of 500 per day. This whole operation was carried out in high secrecy 1 month before it took place, and KVD ordered to interrupt their mail correspondence with families. So in April and May, the prisoners willingly believed that they are about to be handled back and sent to a neutral country and get liberated. They were waiting for the next shipment. And in order to reassure them even more, every time before this group was dispatched, each group was given a new package of mail from families. As soon as executions were over, it was followed by a targeted campaign of disinformation. Every time inquiries came from their families why mailing was stopped, and some rare instances of inquiries from Polish Red Cross and International Red Cross, responses were given via the Soviet Red Cross saying, we have no information about this individual. And after beginning of German invasion to the USSR in June 1941, the USSR had to make a military alliance with Great Britain and then sign a treaty with legitimate Polish government in exile in London. This Soviet-Polish agreement about restoration of Soviet-Polish relations announced invalid the agreement with Germany about division of Poland, and envisaged that all Polish citizens were in Soviet imprisonment camps and in Siberian exile would be set free and would take part in fighting against Germany in the so-called Anders Army, and it was envisaged that that army would be put together out of those who were set free. And so after that agreement, the inquiries about the fate of individuals that had disappeared, the inquiries were made not only by families and the Red Cross, but also by the Polish government and military command. But the answers remained unchanged. We know nothing. In December of 1943, in a personal meeting with Polish Prime Minister Władysław Sikorski and Polish military commander in USSR Władysław Anders, Stalin said that maybe those Polish officers ran away to Manchuria. But as soon as on April 13, 1943, Berlin radio announced that mass graves of Polish officers who had been shot were found 2 days later, a Soviet government made an official statement from Soviet Politburo that those Polish prisoners of war had been used in labor used by the in summer of 1941 had been seized by the Germans. So this was an unintended self-revealing lie. They made a new lie that revealed the old lie, which now they were saying that Germans had caught those prisoners of war and executed them. This was phase 2. So after Smolensk and the region was liberated by the Soviet Union, this version of German crime was perpetuated by a special commission that was named a Special Commission for Establishment of Circumstances of Shooting of Polish officers in Katyn Forest by German invaders. Even before the committee published its report, its goal was determined by the title. This announcement was signed in January 1944 by Professor Burdenko and other members of the commission. But as soon as Smolensk was retaken, as soon as October 1943, specially dispatched NKVD officers sent from Moscow, so-called Chekists, the Soviet secret police, they were sent on purpose from Moscow, and they were preparing falsified proofs for the future commission to show that it was Germans' fault. They prepared evidence which allegedly would show that these prisoners had been shot by Germans in the fall of 1941. They prepared some local residents to testify, and in the pockets of those shot prisoners, they stuffed all kinds of papers dated 1941. One of the key proofs, there are many of them in that report of Burdenko Commission, but one of the key proofs was falsified notes made in a notebook of a local lawyer who the occupation force appointed to be the city mayor, and who then withdrew with Germans from Smolensk. Another evidence was testimony of Boris Vasilevsky, his former deputy, who stayed in Smolensk. In exchange for pardon, he testified that allegedly in the fall of 1941 he was told by his chief that Germans executed Polish prisoners of war. This man, Menshagin, who had not known anything in 1945, he ended up serving 25 years in a Soviet prison, but he is an interesting figure, and I have no time to speak much about him, but I want to say that a big book by Pavel Polyan was published about Boris Menshagin, and I'm happy to give this book now to the Katyn Institute. So, going back to the Burdenko Commission report, it became the base of Soviet version for several decades, and in order to legalize it internationally, the USSR tried to use the Nuremberg trial against key military criminals of Nazis, Germany. The Burdenko report was presented there as proof of German atrocity, and it was included in the official charges against the accused. The USSR counted on the rules of the tribunal, which required that such documents presented by parties would be accepted without analysis. However, the defenders of the German defendants were able to have to bring testimonial witnesses, and the witnesses presented by German defenders convincingly disproved the Soviet version, whereas the testimonial witnesses from the prosecutor, Soviet prosecutor, were so unconvincing that the shooting of Polish officers in Katyn was not included in the final sentencing of the International Tribunal. Nevertheless, in the course of several decades afterwards, the Soviet Union continued to insist that the Polish officers in Katyn Forest were shot by Germans in the fall of 1941, and they kept making references to the International Military Tribunal, even though the tribunal had not formally ruled that the Katyn execution will not be a part of the sentencing. So Western claims about Soviet crimes were officially denounced by USSR Foreign Ministry as Goebbels-style propaganda and anti-Soviet Nazi-invented lies. Only 50 years later, in April of 1990, an official statement of Soviet government was published about immediate responsibility of Beria, Merkulov and his henchmen for this heavy crime of Stalinist regime. And they tried to avoid mentioning NKVD at all. They just said Beria, Merkulov and their henchmen. This was the beginning of the third phase of the history of Katyn narrative in Russia. On the same day, Gorbachev handed a batch of documents about NKVD executions to President Jaruzelski of Poland. And at that same year, the Russian prosecutor's office started a formal investigation of this crime. They established previously unknown places of burial of the prisoners from Starobelsk camp and Kalinin camp. They established the initiators, the participants and the organizers of those shootings. They were able to find and record testimony of several of them, including a former NKVD chief Supranenko and Tokarev. They were able to disprove or reveal the falsification of the work of Burdenko Commission. And in 93 decisions of Politburo were published on the orders of Boris Yeltsin, which revealed the guilt of Stalin and other Soviet leaders, showing that it was their decisions permissions to shoot those people. And a special statement of Russian Duma, Russian legislature, in 2010 was also made about recognizing this crime. Does this mean that Katyn lie has been revealed, totally revealed in Russia? Formally, yes, because for 20 plus years, Russian government no longer blames German invaders for this. But in reality, the position of today's official Russia is duplicitous and even though they recognize that thousands of Polish citizens had been executed, the whole world did not believe in this, but this is important for the Russian people. On the other hand, Russian courts and prosecutors still refuse to recognize individual Polish prisoners of war as victims of those shots, even though their names are listed in the documents of 1940, but the prosecutor's office refuses to verify the political motive of those killings and even admit the fact of their individual killings. In other words, the victims are still discussed as an anonymous mass of individuals. If they are anonymous, then this crime will be perceived as an abstract crime. And they continue to make efforts are continued to soften public perception of this crime by means of creating so-called anti-Katyn. The claims that the shootings of Polish officers in 1940 was kind of like retaliation for the mass executions of Soviet Red Army soldiers and officers by Polish Army in 1920, even though there are no documents that would confirm this, and there is no reason to make any guesses about the motives of Stalin and his henchmen. This motive was clearly formulated in that report by Beria to the Central Committee of Communist Party. This letter, this report explains that those listed, enumerated individuals need to be shot because, quote, they all are incorrigible and ingrained enemies of the Soviet power. And I want to say that Soviet documents have not a single mention in the archives that these individuals were interrogated about their participation on the war of 1920. And I think that line from Beria fully explains the motive. The formal investigation by Russian prosecutors was stopped in 2004 with motivation suspects have been dead. And there is some unofficial but reliable information that only 4 individuals were recognized as guilty party, and that is the chief of NKVD Beria and his deputies Merkulov, Kapulov and Bashtakov. These 4 individuals were qualified by the Military Prosecutor's Office of Russia in accordance with Article 193 of Criminal Code of 1940 as abuse of power by chiefs of Red Army. Wherefore, the key culprits, Stalin himself and other political leaders, are no longer indicated as guilty, but guilt is placed on a few individuals in NKVD who allegedly just abused their powers, whereas Stalin Stalin has nothing to do with this. So the names and bios of 193 participants and organizers of those shootings, from top chiefs to individual shooters and drivers of trucks, were established by historians and published. And there is a book by Nikita Petrov, awarded for killings. And I'm giving this book to Katyn Institute. But those participants of the crimes were not recognized by the prosecutor's office as guilty. Apparently, following the idea that if you fulfilled orders, I have 2 more minutes, okay. If you fulfilled orders, you're not guilty. All this position of Russia's government essentially contradicts the statement of Russian government of 1990 about responsibility for this crime. It reflects the moral problems of the Russian state. And I'm sure that this is our internal problem for Russia primarily. And secondly, it's a problem for Russian-Polish relations. A legal resolution of this problem would help provide a more healthy future for the Russian nation. And we believe that the necessary legal steps to be taken is, number 1, to fully declassify and publish all materials of the investigation done by a Russian military prosecutor. Number 2, continue that investigation and give an adequate evaluation of this of Katyn Massacre as a military crime, instead of that grotesque qualification based on the Criminal Code of 1940. Number 3, it is important to recognize Stalin and other members of Politburo as guilty in this crime, as together with all others who carried out the orders, and their names need to be published. Number 4, the names and places of burial of all Polish citizens that were shot based on the orders of March 5th, 1940. All those who were executed need to be proclaimed rehabilitated in accordance with the law. Thank you.
So we're going to have some questions from the audience, but while the audience is getting ready, I want to ask a couple of questions. I have a question for Professor Nowak. So obviously after the war, Poland became communist, came under the communist regime. What was the understanding of the Katyn Massacre then? Was there a collective memory of it separate from what the government was saying and doing? What was that like?
Actually, it was quite popular, widespread, to say the least, knowledge. Who did it? Due to the mass audience, the Berlin radio reached as the only available radio during the Nazi occupation of Poland. And even though Poles didn't trust, obviously, Germans who killed many hundreds of thousands of Poles during that time, nevertheless, it was so obvious, the lists and the context of that fact, that most of the people, especially after the breach of relations that was decided by Stalin exactly over the Katyn issue, the breach of relations with Sikorski government, that Stalin has ill will, that Stalin hides something. That was obvious for many hundreds of thousands of Poles. And Katyn also created something that could be called a relatively big community of mourning or of memory. That is, thousands of people who were members of families. By the way, I have to add to the victims. Right after Katyn operation in April 1940, there were deported 60,000 of members of Katyn massacre victims. These family members were sent, just in case, to Kazakhstan. Of course, only those who lived under Soviet occupation, those who lived under German occupation survived. Many, by the way, who went to Kazakhstan also survived, but experienced all atrocities of the Soviet labor camps. Nevertheless, these family members were numbered in thousands. Of these 14,000 officers and taken together 22,000 missing persons. That's why there was unofficial but absolutely widespread knowledge that Katyn was the deed of NKVD and Stalin. Of course, it was banned by the official authorities that came from Moscow to Poland. Even though there was an interesting effort of a Polish procurator who tried to reveal the truth, Procurator Martini, in an official investigation in 1945-1946. But he was immediately killed in 1946 by a young girl in a mysterious, so to speak, accident. Just like many others, I would say, people who had a real knowledge of what happened in Katyn. They were either terrorized or eliminated, not only in Poland, but also in other countries. But this is a different story. So, from my perspective, when I attended to school in 60s and early 70s, I mean primary school, my history teacher, who happened to be my mom, taught truth. That was really risky. My teacher of military training, because there was such a time that we had this military training in primary schools, thought that these were Germans responsible. Of course, no one believed him, but he was giving I am not a very big victim, but nevertheless, you could earn the worst possible grade for telling the truth about that. That's it. That's not much, of course. But that depicts the situation in 60s, 70s. And Gomułka, who ruled Poland for a long time, decided he knew perfectly well what happened in Katyn, that for geopolitical reasons, we should never allow to debate openly Katyn. So he didn't trust the Soviets, he didn't believe in their friendship, but due to geopolitical character of his own rule over Poland and its basis in Moscow, he decided, and of course it was continued under Gierek, that the truth should not be revealed.
Thank you very much. And Alexander, I have a question for you. Outside Memorial, is Katyn something that is discussed in the Russian society? Where does it fit in the current existing or non-existing debate about Stalin's repressions and broader political repressions in the Soviet Union?
I would say that the main problem in the Russian society today is deep ignorance about facts related to Katyn. I can refer to a sociological survey, which actually is 10 years old. If we can see my slide, I could show you the numbers. That's a survey that was done by Levada Center in Moscow. You can see that in March of 2010, why it is important. This was March. This was before the accident with Polish airplane that brought the delegation from Poland, led by the president. So this was in March. Before, people heard something about Katyn. Only 43% heard something. 47% knew nothing, and 10% were not sure. But of course, after the accident in Smolensk, when they twice watched the film Katyn by Andrzej Wajda, it was first shown before the accident and second time after the accident, then the number of those who knew something has grown much, 74%. But among those who knew something, they were asking, who do you think was guilty of this crime? And table 2 only applies to those 47% of the first table. So out of those who heard something, only 19% believed that the USSR was the guilty party. 28% continued thinking that Germany was guilty, and 53%, that's the majority, who just did not have an opinion. They heard something but didn't know who did it. And this terrible event, the accident with the airplane, it did not change much in those perceptions. So from my viewpoint, the fact that many people in our country continue to believe that the Germans did it, and all information that the USSR had done it, this is just like a plot against Russia, a big campaign against Russia. And people who believe in that, it's not their guilt, it's their problem. They don't know facts, they don't understand facts. So we need to continue enlightenment, continue public awareness efforts, and bring facts to people, because facts persuade better than anything else. We don't need to create an impression that Memorial is that key location, or maybe the single location where they speak about Katyn. That's not true. In fact, those feelings that the problem of Katyn is a problem for us, for our public thinking, public conscience. The number of those people who feel it is growing, and this can be our only hope for future hopeful change in public conscience, that it will take one day when the level of awareness will reach and surpass some critical level.
So I want to, before we move to questions, I also want to give a chance for our honored guest, Kazimierz Eitner, to introduce himself. He's the grandson of one of the victims of the massacre. So please, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. Very quickly, I just wanted to give a personal character to the atrocity. My grandfather came from Wielkopolska, the German-occupied part of Poland prior to World War I. He lived in Germany for about a decade, working and starting his family there, and came back to Poland to be a representative of the Poles in Germany in the first Sejm Dzielnicowy, the parliament, district parliament in Poznań. He proceeded to train in the national police, and at the outset of the war, he was the head of a police precinct in right on the German border. And of course, he ended up in Russian hands. He ended up in Ostashkov. And he ended up, thanks to the excellent work of Dr. Guryanov, in the very first day that the prisoners were shipped to Kalinin to be killed. The rest of my family, my other grandfather having been an osadnik, having fought in that Polish Bolshevik War you referred to, the rest of my family, entire family on both sides, were deported to Russian labor camps in 1940, ended up getting out through Iran, and ended up in refugee camps in Tanganyika, British East Africa. And it was in 1948 that my grandmother, Mrs. Eitner, learned from a letter sent to her from her sister's inquiries with the Polish embassy in Moscow that, yes, in fact, her husband had been killed in Katyn, at the hands of the Hitlerites, which of course they didn't believe for a minute because they had a postcard from him from Christmas Day 1939 from Ostashkov. So my own personal history underscores everything that was said here, and I thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much for joining us. Okay, do we have questions from the audience? Please, right here. Please wait for the microphone. Please introduce yourselves, and let's be brief because we have in stating your question, please.
John Trop, I have a question for Professor Novak. What's the best book to read about the Polish operation of the NKVD?
Actually, I mentioned two very good American books that are available. I mean, Norman Naimark's, professor of Stanford University, Stalin's Genocides. And of course, only a part, but the central part of this book is about a Polish operation from 1937, 1938. Also, Timothy Snyder in his Bloodlands, a whole chapter dedicates to this operation. And the third book of a renowned American scholar that I want to recommend is the book also mentioned by me, that is Terry Martin's Affirmative Action Empire, about the Soviet. It was published by Cornell University. He's professor at Harvard. It is about a general nationality policy of Stalin's Soviet Union, but again, Polish operation is a central part of this narrative. Unfortunately, I must admit, there is no single good academic book written by Polish historians, though there are a lot of interesting sources published in Poland, especially after Ukrainian archives of KGB were opened to actually academic investigation, and two thick volumes of these documents from Ukrainian KGB concerning Kharkov operation are now available. So this is the fourth book that I would recommend. Of course, there are older books, very, very good, very important, by Janusz Zawodny, by Józef Mackiewicz, but these are supplemented by new knowledge of documents that we learned only after 1990.
Thank you. Do we have, okay, over there, please.
Hi, my name's Alex Schmidt. So I have a question. You said that it's possible, obviously you can't go in Stalin's mind, but there was a possible that it could be revenge for the 1920 independence war between Polish and Soviet Union. So I have a question. Is it also possible, if it could have been down to geopolitics under Machiavelli's principle, that you get rid of all the opposition so there's no rebellion as well, which he says in The Prince in Machiavelli, where you get rid of all the opposition and the higher-ups so that the rebellions can't happen. So how much do you think of it was more personal revenge, and how much do you think was geopolitics? Mm-hmm. Either professor could answer.
So I must say that I agree completely with Dr. Guryanov that personal elements didn't play, according to my knowledge, key importance. There are interesting studies of Stalin's personal relationship to different nationalities. For example, another very good American historian, Professor Hiroaki Kuromiya from Indiana University, published a very interesting study about this issue. And he says that Stalin was not personally anti-Polish. He was anti any nationality, against any nation, save maybe his imagined construct of Russian Empire, Russian Soviet Empire, but with Russia in its center. But he could kill as many Russians as he could, just like with Poles or with any other nations. So he was cold-blooded, unimaginably cold-blooded politician, geopolitical politician. And I think these geopolitical reasons that identified Polish elite with anti-imperial Russian, anti-Soviet, anti-communist side were predominant in his decision. I mentioned this Finland context because, of course, Stalin thought all the time the same about Polish elites. But the moment when he decided that it is the best time to kill them came exactly at that particular, I would say, overlap with the end of Finnish war.
Ну, вы знаете, я, собственно, не
You know,
специалист,
I'm not
никогда
really
не
an
занимался
expert, and I
изучением
never
возможных
studied
мотивов
possible
Сталина и
motives of
пытаться
Stalin,
понять,
so
чем он руководствовался.
I never
Вот я
tried
уже
to
сказал, что
understand
с моей
his
точки зрения
motivations. But
того,
from my
что
perspective,
написано
what I
в
think what's
письме Берии,
written
вполне
in that document
достаточно.
signed by Beria is
Значит, у
sufficient.
меня есть некоторая
I
гипотеза,
have a hypothesis of
которая идет
sorts,
немножко вразрез с тем,
which
что тут до сих пор
is slightly
говорилось
different
про
from what
принятие этого
was being
решения.
said here about
Мне
this
кажется,
decision.
но я не
I
берусь
think,
отстаивать
but
эту
I'm not
гипотезу
insisting on it
документально.
with
Хотя
documents,
есть документальные
even though there are
некоторые
some
указания,
documents
которые,
which
с
may be
которыми эта гипотеза
indications,
согласуется.
and
Что вообще
they are
всё
consistent
решение
with that hypothesis.
о расстреле
And
польских
it is that the
оно
whole
было
decision
в
about
какой-то
shooting
степени
Polish
принято
prisoners of
немножко
war
случайно.
was made kind
И
of
что изначально,
by
когда их
incident,
взяли в плен,
incidental.
держали вот эти там
Initially,
несколько
when they were
месяцев,
kept prisoners and
осенью
in
1939
those
года, и
camps
даже в
since
начале
the fall of
40-го года, вообще
1939
мысль
and
о
early
физической
1940,
ликвидации
there
вот
was
этих
no
категорий,
thought
вот этих 8,5
about
тысяч
physically
офицеров,
liquidating
офицеров
those
было 8,5
8,5 thousand military
тысяч
officers
полицейских
plus
в Осташково. И плюс
5,5
еще,
thousand police
значит, около 1000 представителей
servants
других силовых ведомств.
and some
Что
other
это,
law enforcement
мысль,
agency
вообще
officials.
впервые
So this whole
гипотеза о том,
idea
что такое
about
решение возникло только в
the
20-х
possibility
числах
of shooting them, there's a suggestion
Её
that
впервые
this idea
опубликовала
was
вот
first
такая
came up in the
замечательная
end of
историк российская
February
Наталья Лебедева.
of 1940. This is published
Есть
by
некоторые документы,
Natalia
которые
Lebedeva, and there are
подтверждают,
some
что это могло
documents
быть
which
именно
confirm
так,
that
и,
that could be the
значит,
case.
произошло случайно.
And so there was some
Управление по
moment
делам
of
НКВД в какой-то момент
it was
20
kind of
февраля
happening.
подало, ну, накануне 20 февраля
The
подало свои предложения, что сделать,
office
предложения, в которых
submitted proposals
предполагалось отпустить часть военнопленных, не
that
очень
included
большую,
setting free some of these prisoners, those who were older and sick, and reserve officers who were primarily civilians, such as doctors and teachers. In fact, the biggest professional group in Kozelsk were teachers recruited to the military service and were commissioned officers just at the beginning of the war. So the chief of the administration for prisoners of war was saying, we can set free those who have no personal compromising information. But I think this draft was sent to Merkulov, and Merkulov immediately sent the orders to transfer all others in accordance with the proposal of Mr. Supranenko. He ordered to send them to prisons to actually do personal investigations on each, because prior to that, such investigation was only done based on for individuals of police officers. Police officers were supposed to be sentenced for 3, 5, or 8 years of imprisonment and sent to gulag camps. So this military prisoners of war administration was waiting for this to happen because they had too much work on their hands. So Merkulov sent those orders, and they began to send some of these little groups of those officers, the more serious ones, from camps to prisons for further investigation. And I think that Merkulov feared to get that decision, make that decision to set free others without approval of Beria and Stalin. So he went to Beria, and then Beria came to Stalin, and they may have had a conversation, and they probably may have decided, it's much simpler to just shoot them. And Natalia Lebedeva believes that the key threat, at that time they did not think much about the future decapitation of the Polish nation. Their thinking was different. They remembered civil war in Russia, which started with the uprising of Czechoslovak, so-called Czechoslovak Corps, the prisoners of war who were kept in Siberia and that's how the Civil War had started. They also remembered the proposals to use Polish military personnel in the war on the side of Finland. So all those threats were considered, and that's just a hypothesis. They were thinking, well, if there is such an attack on Baku oil reserves, and those prisoners of war may start an uprising. And this is something that sounds like an alternative hypothesis, but the documents which I studied, this proposal to set some of them free and others to be placed under investigation, there is some consistency in the facts, but I cannot claim that this hypothesis is true. But if from the very beginning investigation was done in all three camps, then the decision, then some things would not have happened. Supranenko would not go to Beria, Beria would not go to Merkulov, or Merkulov to Beria, Beria to Stalin. But when all these things were happening, there is also a hypothesis that the decision was made only in that little corridor of time between the end of Finnish war, like March 13th is when it was over, and the beginning of German invasion into Norway and Denmark. That was the little window of time, because afterwards, according to Anders' recollections, he was sharing Berling's recollections that in the fall of 1940, Beria and Stalin had been thinking that maybe they should not have done that, some kind of a feeling like that. But it's too late to talk about it.
Okay, over there, please.
Good afternoon, Andrzej Dąbrowski, Polish Institute of International Affairs, DC office. Less of a question, more of a favor to Professor Andrzej Nowak. Could you elaborate on two following topics? The first, could you explain more about the social and ethnical structure of the Polish officers from the auxiliary forces? Because there is an interesting story behind that. And the second one, you said something about the British approach towards the Katyn murders, but would you like to elaborate more on what was the political stance of the other Western allies, United States and France? Thank you.
Thank you. I will begin from the second question. Actually, there is another book which I can recommend to answer your second question. Eugenia Maresz, Polish-British scholar who published a book about Katyn in England, specifically in England or in the United Kingdom. That's a very sad story, actually, because as long as till 1973, it was almost like in communist Poland. No one could say openly anything about Katyn in the United Kingdom. Only 30 years after 1943, the moment when Katyn graves were revealed by the Germans, there was this period of 30 years of ban for access to archival materials from Foreign Office, documents from Foreign Office depicting internal reactions of Foreign Office clerks during that crisis, so to speak, diplomatic crisis with the Soviet Union that loomed on the horizon, were revealed, and this actually moved the memory of Katyn to the open space in the United Kingdom, a monument to Katyn victims who was raised in London afterwards. Actually, also a British officer of POW, British POW, that was sent by Germans in a commission, international commission, to investigate Katyn graves in 1943, Colonel Van Fleet, also was able to publish his memories from Katyn grave only many years after 1973. It was simply impossible to him to do it in the United Kingdom due to so-called realistic school of thinking about history and politics. As regards the United States, during the Cold War, especially in its third stage, a so-called commission of Congressman Madden from Indiana was set up, and it published its multi-volume investigation papers in 1952, just before death, actually December 1952, just before death of Stalin. But it was downplayed immediately, the results that were really revealing, shocking, due to the death of Stalin, because with the death of Stalin, American administration pondered that maybe there's a chance to improve relationship with the Soviet Union, so maybe we should stop investigating further Katyn problem. And that was roughly the gist of my answer to your second question. As regards the first question, again, I can suggest to read Jerzy Łojek, one of very important Polish scholars who studied Katyn Massacre, his book about Katyn, where he in a very detailed way studies professions of those killed in Katyn, especially in Katyn, because he didn't have access to other three camps or prisons victims. And this revealed that even if it was not aimed at Polish head, it really struck at Polish head, speaking symbolically or figuratively. Number of teachers, medicine doctors, lawyers was significant not only symbolically, but it was an important percentage. I cannot quote it now, but it was an important percentage of all medicine doctors, all lawyers, or architects in Poland. So it effectively hit Polish elites. So unfortunately, I have to stop at this point.
And I just want to add very quickly that the professional breakdown of the victims of Katyn Massacre in Kozelsk camp, the doctors, the teachers, the lawyers, we have that in our book published in 2015, including by their education levels, and the same applies to those shot from Ostashkova.
Thank you very much. So this concludes our session here, but we invite you to join us at the reception across the hall. And I want to thank the Polish Embassy for making the reception possible. I recommend that if you want to speak to the speakers, join us at the reception. They will be there, and it's better if you talk to them there. Also, on the way to the reception and to the exhibit, please grab some books. Again, courtesy of the Polish Embassy, we have some books on the Katyn Massacre. And on the way back, please also, on the way out, please return your headsets. Thank you very much for joining us, and let's thank the speakers.